Hi, I'm Julie Hornock with United in Autism. I'm a parent of a child on the autism spectrum and also the author of the book, United in Autism, Finding Strength Inside the Spectrum. The foreword for this book was written by Temple Grandin, and the book is 30 stories of families living with autism from all over the world. I think it is so important that we share our stories. We need to share them to raise awareness and also just so people kind of know how to help us. So every week I'm going to bring you an interview with either an expert or a parent, and they're going to share all kinds of tips that are going to help you in your journey. I cannot wait for you to see who we have for you today. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today I have Valerie W. Hey Valerie.
Hi Julie, how are you? Finally we get to meet face to face.
I know, it makes me so happy. So before we get into everything we're going to talk about today, which I am so excited for the update you're going to bring, I want to tell you guys all about Valerie. Valerie's story was in the book, United in Autism, and then she talked about her son, Matt, so we'll talk about him a little bit, but she is a brilliant scientist, and she's going to give us some updates on autism research. So let me read her bio to you because it is a lot of giant words, and there's no way I can memorize how important she is. So Valerie is a professor of biochemistry and molecular medicine at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences in Washington, D.C., as well as the mother of a son with autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Hugh is trained as a chemist with a Ph.D. in chemistry from California Institute of Technology and a B.S. in chemistry from the University of Hawaii. She has a long research history of cross-disciplinary studies focused on protein structure, function, and relationships, and membrane protein interactions. In late 2004, because of her personal interest in ASD, she redirected her research focus towards autism. And this is where we come in because you have just been to a big conference and you're going to share that information with us. And I can't wait for everyone to hear it. I know they're very excited about this. But before we get there, I want to hear an update on your son. It's been a while since we talked. How's he doing?
He's doing fine. Matt is now 31, going on 32 next month. And I think that, you know, he is doing quite well. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
Great. And what we're most excited about is a part-time job that he started last June. And this was the second part-time job, so now he holds two. But this job is at what used to be called the National Database for Autism Research. So what that is a NIH-funded repository of all the data that they support on autism, just recently expanded now to include all of the neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, the whole works.
Wow.
So this is an expanding data repository, but you know, he is specifically now working on the autism data, which I think is really wonderful because, you know, it should have personal meaning for him. And I'm hoping that this will be something that will give him kind of stepstones to kind of increasing his own knowledge and his skills such that hopefully it will eventually maybe be expanded into a more full-time position, something that where he can grow in. You know, so I'm really pleased with how he's doing. But like all people on the spectrum, as you know, and I think all the people who will be listening to this will know, parents of children on the spectrum, the most difficult thing about autism for almost everybody is the social piece, right?
Yeah.
I think our children's ability to really understand other people, to understand their mindset, you know, to kind of see into other people's minds, to can naturally do this, as well as to carry on reciprocal social conversations.
So is that what he's doing? He's probably doing fantastic with the work at work, but is that what he's doing, struggling with interacting with coworkers?
Right. Well, I don't know so much with coworkers because I'm told that a lot of the people that work at this database, as you can see, you would expect to be very computer oriented. Yeah. Many of them are a little bit on the more socially introverted side. So they could, you know, many of them, well, some of them at least, may have a form of high functioning type of autism or Asperger's syndrome. Okay. So not so much at work, but he tries very hard to meet other people because he's, you know, almost 32. Of course, he's interested in socializing. So he goes to a lot of social meetup groups in the, in the, you know, in the, just in the community. So the people that come there after work are just neurotypicals. And I think he probably has difficulty, you know, with really mingling with them the way a neurotypical person would. But he tries. At least he has the, you know, desire to do that, and he tries. And it's really funny because ever since I started studying autism, the main purpose is to try to understand the biology better so that we can target medications more intelligently towards individuals, you know, because Matt, in his lifetime, since he was 6.5 to about 21 years old, he was prescribed about 20 or more different medications on a hit and miss basis, kind of like try this, try that, and so forth. I would say none of them had really any positive effects. A lot of them had negative side effects, which is what brought me into the research field in autism, to try to understand the biology better. So at the age of about 21, 22, we decided to take him off of everything, all these medications, because I didn't see what good they were doing. But he did tell me, Mom, because he knew I'm, you know, obviously studying autism. He says, if there's ever a medication that helps him understand women better, he'd give it a try.
Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful sense of humor. That's so.
No, but you know, it's true. It's true. And you know, a lot of dads, when they hear me say that, they say, so would we. You know?
I know, that's what I was going to say. I think any man, you know, would love to have that to understand women better.
Okay, so we're still looking for that magic key, you know, to unlock that area of autism, the social understanding. And to me, it's a real biggie.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really beautiful how our kids are coming full circle. And I mean that by, you know, here he is, has autism, struggles his whole young life to kind of fit in and be in the world. But then he's the one that is going to, our kids with autism are going to be the ones that provide us with the answers. And I really believe that they'll come around, and because it's of interest to them, because they want to learn, they're going to be the ones to look around and share the chemistry of it, share everything about it. And I think even just seeing all of these adults with autism step up and share what it's like to have autism, and hey, you know, don't be feeling sorry for us. You know, we're fine. We're doing good. We like who we are. And for us to learn from them. And I think in that same way, your son is so invested in what he's learning, he's going to find answers where we couldn't.
Right. And I do understand, you know, there are some people on the spectrum who say, we don't need fixing, you know, leave us alone. And that's fine, because I've told my son, no one's ever going to force you to take any kind of medication if you don't want to take. But I think at the same time, as research discovers new things and makes new medications or interventions available, at least some people who really desire some help in certain areas have that, you know, availability. Well, and so I think that's the important thing, that everyone, no one needs to feel threatened by researching autism. In that we want to change a person's personality, because they each have their own personalities. And, you know, obviously we don't want to change what's unique to them. But, you know, I can see how difficult it is that Matt does struggle with this social interaction business. And if there's something around that can help make that easier for him, I think it would improve his life. And I think he would agree with that too.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a big difference in between an adult that is able to share with you, hey, I like the way I am in this, and an adult that is struggling every day in pain, or struggling every day not knowing what's going on in the world, where their life's in danger, they're walking out in the streets. You know, there's a really big difference in that spectrum. And when you get, I always felt like with my daughter, you know, I never want to take her personality away. I love exactly who she is. And when she says, I'm doing this because I like it, okay, then I'm not going to change. As long as you're not in harm's way, I'm not going to change that. But if there is things for anxiety and other issues that they struggle with, I think it's incredible and we have to continue to look, because we want to help them be the best versions of themselves. So maybe just give us, so tell us about the conference you went to and kind of the latest and greatest in the autism research.
Yeah, it's really hard to summarize the latest and the greatest, because there's such a broad range of topics that are covered at the International Meeting for Autism Research. You know, everything, say, from, you know, heavy duty science, whether or not it's brain imaging or genetics or gene expression, epigenetics, the whole works in terms of the, kind of the biological sciences and education. There's a lot of research in education from the neuropsychology standpoint, nutrition, everything, the works. So you see everything, and obviously I can only attend a very small fraction. Right. For example, there were over 2,500 people at this meeting and over 1,500 presentations. So that's a lot.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
To try to digest. But I kind of went to the things that I was interested in, and what I could see from my standpoint is I think there's more of there's more attention being paid now to the heterogeneity of the disorder. I think as parents of children on the spectrum, it doesn't come as a surprise to any of us that there's tremendous heterogeneity in the manifestation of symptoms, right? Because you can look at your child in the context of other children with ASD, and you can see how different they all are. Mm-hmm. And these differences, both the phenotypic, clinical differences, and genetic differences, were really not taken into account very much when scientists do these large-scale studies, whether or not it's genetics or gene expression, omics studies, any of these studies that involve investigating tens of thousands of genes at once, because a lot of the thought in terms of doing these studies with, autism, people with autism versus people that don't have autism, so-called case control studies, is that the greater the number of cases that we have, the higher the probability of identifying significant genes or SNPs, genetic variants, right? That, in other words, there's power in the numbers. Mm-hmm. And that's true for most things that are homogeneous. In other words, if everything was the same and you had greater numbers, you would have a greater signal with respect to significance. But with something like autism, that's very heterogeneous, very diverse, mm-hmm. that if you don't take care to at first define what you're actually studying by breaking down the heterogeneity, by dividing the population, ASD population, into more clinically distinct subgroups of individuals, and then doing these large-scale studies, I think you're going to get a lot of noise in the data. So what I was pleased with from the talks that I went to anyway, is that there are more of awareness that you need to do this mm-hmm. in almost every area, whether or not you're doing brain imaging, whether or not you're doing genetics or gene expression studies, or even medication studies. And I went to one talk on medications. Where are we with the medications, right? And if I understood this right, virtually none of the medication studies have been successful, I put that in quotation marks, in terms of having significant differences in terms of the effectiveness of the medication. And I think to a large part, that stems from the heterogeneity of autism. Because if you're testing the efficacy of a given medication, and you're just giving it essentially on a blanket scale to all the individuals in your study who have autism, without paying attention to their specific phenotype, in other words, their clinical diversity, then it doesn't surprise me that you wouldn't have significance in terms of efficacy for that particular medication, right. Even though there are certain individuals within that case group that they're studying that seem to be responders. So I think that points out the need to really subtype individuals for any study, including the medication responsiveness studies.
Okay, and so they're starting to recognize that, and they're putting everyone in different subsets. And what are they looking at for the subset?
They're realizing the need to do that. I'm not saying they're all doing that, okay. But this is something that we have done in my studies. And so if you post the link to my website, mm-hmm. you will see how we've done that. Mm-hmm. And we've done this sort of breaking down the autism population into subtypes, starting first with what has been recognized as the gold standard behavioral diagnostic, which is the ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. It's a parent questionnaire that's administered by a neuropsychologist. So what we did is we took the clinical data from that test, behavioral test, that scored for severity across over 100 different questions that probing the individual's clinical symptoms, behaviors, etc. And then we did some cluster analysis. In other words, we did some sorting out of individuals to try to find groups of individuals that had similarities in the overall clinical profiles. And then we did our large-scale omics studies, like gene expression studies or genetic studies, based upon the individuals in each of these separate subgroups. And we identified 4 subgroups. And this really went a long way towards reducing the noise in the data, allowing us to actually detect significant genes and genetic variants in each of the subtypes, some of which can overlap with each other, which you would expect, because there is a commonality across all of autism in a certain case. You would expect that, right? But then it also allows us to pick out genes, differentially expressed genes that are unique to a given subtype. And that's, I think, that is what you need for targeted therapies too. Because if you can pick out distinct pathways, biochemical pathways that this group is affected by, but not this group, then you're more able, I think, to target your medications towards trying to ameliorate or correct whatever deficits occur in that particular pathway. And it would not be appropriate for other subgroups. In other words, people in other subgroups.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because even as just the kids that I know in the moms, we talk about the differences, and like you said, our differences are so great, and some of the things I've done for my daughter have had zero effect for those other kids, and it's quite funny. And so I think it's fantastic to have the scientific evidence behind that, I mean, that's
right. And I think that, this is a concept that many scientists, unfortunately, have been slow to come to. Right? I mean, in the field, because as I said, genetics to a large extent relies upon statistics. And in statistics, you rely upon large numbers, for significance. But, that, as I said, it only applies if you have homogeneous, entities within your case group, But it doesn't apply when you have just a mishmash of all kinds of different subtypes in there, individuals that have much different symptoms clinically, and they're seeing that there are differences in the brain imaging too, which is not surprising. It really isn't surprising to me. So I was really pleased to see that there is more attention being paid almost after the fact to the need to really break autism down into subtypes for these very, very complex studies. The other thing that I saw a little bit more of is something that we actually have been doing, at least in my lab, which is the integration of studies across different so-called omics platforms. In other words, we try to integrate epigenetic studies, which goes beyond just looking at DNA sequences. We're looking at gene regulation. So we're integrating mechanisms of gene regulation with gene expression and trying to determine which genes that are altered in terms of the levels in which they appear in cells, which regulatory mechanisms might be involved in this dysregulation. Because one can also look to these regulatory mechanisms for therapeutic targets. Does it make sense? Because what we've found in our studies is that for any given subgroup of individuals, let's say if we're talking about gene expression, and what that refers to is the level at which genes are turned off or on in cells. So if we're talking about gene expression, and we're looking at, in my case, we looked at 3 different subtypes of autism. We found anywhere from hundreds to thousands of genes that are dysregulated or deregulated in different subtypes. And we're talking about thousands of genes or even hundreds of genes. You're not thinking that you're going to have hundreds to thousands of mutations in that individual, genetic mutations in the DNA. So it's more likely that some of those differences might arise from dysfunctional regulatory mechanisms that can turn on batteries or turn on or turn off a whole slew of genes at once, just because that regulatory mechanism is faulty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if a child has 1,000 genes that are off, then they would appear maybe to be more severe than a child.
That's exactly what we saw. That the most severe subtype that we studied, which are those that, just by our clustering method, the most severe subtype were those that were severely language impaired, because associated with that, there were also many genes that associated with epilepsy, sleep problems. And honestly, because my son Matt is really quite healthy, I was not aware of all these other comorbidities, as they call them, because, we didn't experience that. But it was only when I started talking about my research to other parents, parent groups, for example, through Autism Speaks or something like that, that parents would come up to me, and when I describe these different subtypes and the genes that are affected in the different subtypes, they'll come up to me, you just described my daughter, who is non-functional, and she has epilepsy, and she has sleep problems. And I'm thinking, wow, that really matches. It maps to the genes, the symptoms map to the genes that we're discovering for that subtype. So, that's where, that's what we're trying to do with our research, to try to identify the biology underlying autism, but realizing that there are many different forms of autism. So you need to define the biology underlying the different subtypes so that you can better treat it.
So then if it's something that is deregulating the genes, then we're going back to looking into what is causing those to not be regulated, right?
Right. And there are many different reasons that could happen. There could be, for example, say, a mutation in the regulator, right? There could be some kind of, but right now, what we are studying in my lab are environmental triggers. Okay? Because environment can also dysregulate genes. And most of the times, environmental triggers work through so-called epigenetic mechanisms. That means it impacts gene regulation without affecting DNA sequence. Because a lot of what you hear about in the autism literature, at least in the past 10 or 20 years, has been about genetics. There's a mutation here and a mutation there, but now there's over 1,000 genetic variants that have been identified for autism. So what does that mean? I think that only recently have people been looking at other than, at causes other than pure genetic changes. And that brings us to the epigenetics. And integrated with epigenetics is also environment. If on my webpage, I have a pyramid that kind of it sort of puts together all of the factors that we're trying to study that we think are contributors to autism. And at the top of this pyramid, I have put the environmental triggers, which includes physiological triggers like hormones and inflammation that is, part of the person, as well as environmental triggers that are external. In other words, in the outside environment, such as pesticides, such as fire, flame retardants, all kinds of stuff that's out there. And that's what my lab is focusing on now. We're looking at environmental triggers that fall into a particular class of compounds, of chemicals that are known as endocrine disruptors. And what that means is that endocrine disruptors are compounds that can interfere with our own hormonal regulation. So you can see, how important hormones are to our physiological functions. And if you have something coming in from the outside that can somehow interfere with our hormonal signaling, you can imagine what kind of trouble that can cause. So recently we have been studying changes in epigenetics, in DNA, in sperm DNA actually, that can be associated with the levels of exposure to certain chemicals. But that's another study, and I don't want to really get too heavy into that because I know you have a whole bunch of other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think it's so interesting how that plays because, yeah, you're right. Everyone has focused on genetics, but it's time to move bigger and broader.
Beyond that.
I'm thankful you're doing that and that the science world is recognizing that because, of course, I feel like that brings us one step closer to helping our kids the way we want to help them and maybe in the future helping future generations, of course, as well.
Right, because, you can't control your genetics, right? You just can't. You're born with it.
Yeah.
But you can control your environment, right?
Well, and
the more we know about environmental factors that may be risk factors for not only autism, but various other diseases such as cancer, cardiovascular, we already accept it. We already accept for cancer and cardiovascular disease that it's gene and environment interactions that really influence a person's risk, right?
Yeah.
But it's only the recognition of environmental contributors to neurodevelopmental disorders has only been relatively recent, that people are saying, oh, well, it could also affect risk for autism, schizophrenia, whatever,
Right.
So only recently have people been looking at that. And what was a little disappointing, I think, from this meeting is that there were so few platforms like oral sessions, or none actually, that were devoted either to epigenetics or to environmental triggers. That's unusual, because in the past there has been at least one session, devoted to epigenetics or to environment, and my lab has presented in both of those. But for example, among 1,500 posters that were divided into different topics, there was only one topic, one cluster of posters that were placed in the epigenetics section, and there were only 10 posters, 10 out of 1,500. That's not to say that there might have been some epigenetic studies buried somewhere in some other category, but in terms of that particular topic, there were only 10. And I didn't see, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't remember seeing any sections that were devoted to environmental triggers. So you've
always been ahead of your time.
I don't know, but that part was a little disappointing, that there wasn't enough there, or at least that was standing out as sort of a separate section,
right?
Yes, the posters or the talks.
So to go back a little bit and kind of bring this in for the parents, so if there's new diagnosis, and they basically, as a parent, and you may remember, it probably was a little bit different 30 years ago, but whenever we just get bombarded and we have a million things to choose from. So could you give us a new parent, any guidance when they're choosing their therapies for their child?
Okay. Well, parents, when you first you don't know where to start, right? You don't know where to start. And, if you go back 29 years when Matt was diagnosed with PDD and OS, there was virtually nowhere to turn. You just all you could rely upon was the school system and, behavioral interventions in our case, through the school system. Now, let's see, with a new parent, I think that, first of all, parents should get as informed as possible about autism. And I guess a lot of times they can seek out help through their local ASA chapters, Autism Society of America, or Autism Speaks chapters is a good place to start. And with respect to therapies, as I said, there is no one size fits all for therapies. And we're still stuck with that. But that being said, there are some types of autism that associate very strongly with metabolic dysfunction. And so if the parent can convince the primary care physician or the pediatrician to at least do a screen for some of the more common metabolic pathways, then that would be a place that could start. And the reason I'm saying this is because if there is, let's say, mitochondrial dysfunction, for one, that's a biggie among a number of kids. That's a subgroup that have mitochondrial dysfunction. If that can be identified, then there are some therapeutic strategies to try to, ameliorate the dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yeah.
So that would be another thing. And, what was surprising to me was that it was not until Matt was in his early 20s that I asked a clinician, autism researcher named Richard Fry, because his focus is on mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic dysfunction. Mm-hmm. And I said, and he wrote a chapter for my book, by the way, and that was his focus. And I said, well, Richard, a kid comes into your clinic. He was then in Arkansas, but he's moved to Phoenix. Mm-hmm. I said, well, how do you identify these metabolic dysfunctions? Because, my son's never had a broad screen, other than the usual that they do, in the doctor's office. So he sent me a list this long of all the tests that he's run. Yeah. And I took it to the doctor and I said, can you please order these tests? Mm-hmm. Not thinking that there would be anything that would pop up, because Matthew, as I said, was quite healthy. Mm-hmm. But I decided it was a good time to do the test because Matt was off of, we finally took him off of all medications. Because I figured that if he was taking a medication, it might interfere with the test, that he might give some false results. So since he wasn't taking anything, we did all these tests. And he came back that he had severe vitamin D deficiency, which was amazing. I didn't expect that.
Yeah.
So as a result,
Yeah.
And vitamin D is really important, not only for bone health, but for many different areas of health. And I think including brain health. Mm-hmm. But, and he was already in his early 20s. So, I have no idea how long he's been severely deficient in vitamin D, and what the impact might have been, during the many years of development, if we had known earlier, but we didn't. So that's one example. And now, as a result, he took massive doses of vitamin D until it was normalized, and now he's on just regular, just maintenance vitamin D capsules. But that's one example. Okay. So I would do that. And one thing I wouldn't do is I know many parents are desperate for a solution, for a treatment. And it worries me because I think that they're less, they're
desperate. They're not thinking rationally. Yeah, I was. Exactly. When I was a parent, I just want to get better. So,
Right. And so they will spend endless amounts of money many times for treatments they may not work. And so I would be really careful about that,
Well, it makes sense to find something that's targeted, do some testing and figure out, okay, if you do have body issues, actual medical issues that you can help, that is proven on paper, you can see it.
Right.
Of course, you're going to treat it just like you would asthma, just like you would anything else. So I think it's smart to figure that out before you go shooting in the dark, because you're, like you had said about the medications, it's scary. Right. And you don't know what the side effects might be, Yeah.
And most of these are neurotropic medications. So, you have no idea what those medications will have, what effect they'll have on a developing brain. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and my son has been taking everything from Ritalin when he was 6.5 to a combination of Abilify and Strattera when he was 21. So, and I just didn't see any benefits, which is why we stopped it. Yeah. Now that goes, aside from that, if a child is taking something that makes a difference night or day, then stick with it. I mean, at least he's doing something, right? Yeah. But if you don't see anything, then it's time to move on. I think what I hear you saying is we're just going to be smarter about what we do with our kids, and don't be so desperate that you do something that hasn't really been looked at or that you don't have any justification for doing. And I always tell parents, okay, just look at the symptoms of what you need help with. If you need help with speech, you go to a speech pathologist. If you need help with behavior, you go to a behavioral therapist. If you have a child that's constipated, you look into that and you get that, you work on constipation. Just look at who your kid is. Right. Don't look at who someone else's kid is. And that goes back to your whole study of autism as the individual in the groups, So. Yeah, right. The other thing is that people are beginning to pay more attention to the comorbidities such as GI problems, sleep problems, right?
Yeah.
And treating those problems, not just burying it under the rug as some side issue, but that
Right.
autism is, because, you know, Margaret Bowman has been a leader in recognizing the association between gastrointestinal disorders and autism, because oftentimes this will affect the most severely impacted children, those that don't have language, so they can't even tell you their tummy hurts,
Right.
but they act out. And so when she recognized that this could really be a problem, you know, that the kid was having severe stomach pains for whatever reason, and began to look into treating that, you know, she in many cases have noticed a change in the behaviors too. But it makes sense, right? It
Right.
makes
Yeah.
sense, because if a child is suffering terrible pains from whatever stomach issues they may have, but they can't verbalize it,
Yeah.
what are they going to do? They're going to act out.
Of course they are. Yeah. I mean, that they every behavior has intention, and that,
Right.
you know, looking behind that. And if my other typical boys had issues with their stomach, I wouldn't ignore it. I wouldn't just say, oh, they're fine. You know, you can't chalk anything up to autism, because we don't even know what autism is. So we don't even know what all it is. So you can't just say, oh, it's just autism. But treating what you know is not correct, just to make them more comfortable. I mean, I don't want my kid in pain. None of us.
But see, sometimes they can't express it. For those that can't express it, you know, the parent will just see the acting out behavior.
Yeah.
And, you know, take them to some kind of behavioral therapist, not realizing that there's a real underlying physiological problem here.
Yeah. Yeah. Checking the physical.
So I think that pediatrician doctors need to be more aware of the sort of the comorbid physiological symptoms.
Yeah.
And not just kind of think of it as something, or not even to investigate.
Yeah, and I think hopefully everyone's coming around to that, because I even think of, like, you look at a child born with Down syndrome. Well, they know that, okay, they have heart problems, and so, okay, but they don't say, oh, he just has Down syndrome, we'll just let him live with that. So what are our problems that go along with autism that we can look at and help our kids to be more comfortable and to feel just more like, you know, like they can do, just not in pain. I don't want anyone to be in pain, or like you said, hormonal, you know, I know when my hormones are off, I'm not really all that nice. So why would we expect them to be if things are off? So I think looking at it from that view is it's eye-opening, and it's necessary.
Right. And the same thing goes for sleep problems. And I didn't realize that sleep was a big issue in autism, but it is for many people. And that's another sign, you know, that there's something wrong, I think, physiologically, when the circadian rhythm's all messed up.
Yeah.
And that in our studies, the circadian rhythm dysfunction also associates with the most severe phenotype. Not that it wouldn't affect some others, but the genes that we see the most genes related to circadian rhythm in the most severe type of autism. So that's another sign, you know. And I think that there are probably some metabolic pathways in circadian rhythm that may be targetable as well.
Well, thank you for all this information. It's a lot to take in, and I love your forward thinking. I think you're brilliant. So I'm so grateful. And tell us, in the midst of all this, you're out saving the world, figuring out autism, you're helping your own son in his job. Tell us how you take care of yourself.
And I think that's really important, especially for moms, you know, because we all know that moms kind of bear the brunt of it with respect to, you know, everything to do with your child and trying to do the most that you can. And, you know, treat yourself nicely, you know, splurge now and then. This is funny, because when my son was younger and he was into some tantrums, right? Sometimes stirred up by my husband. You know, men sometimes are clueless. Like, he'll say some things and Matt will go off. And then, you know, the mom has to kind of like put the genie back in the but anyway, so I'll say, okay, I'm going shopping. I'm gone. So, you know, you treat yourself nicely, because otherwise you'd go crazy. But there's one more thing I just wanted to add with respect to what can we do for our children
Yeah.
that doesn't involve medications. And this is something that I say when people, if I'm speaking at a meeting, and parents will always say, so what's your advice? What's your recommended treatment? And I always say, look, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not going to recommend any medications, especially in this hit or miss business, right? But I always say, well, and this applies to anybody, not just with our kids with autism, but I would say give them as enriched an environment as possible, because enriched environments promote synaptic remodeling and connection. So that's only good.
Yeah.
And it could be any form, it could be music, it could be art, it could be anything the child enjoys that you can just kind of, provide them with some kind of mental and physical stimulation. I think that's good.
Yeah, I think finding their strengths and finding what they love and just running with it instead of always focusing on the negatives of what they do.
The second thing that I advise is try to reduce stress in any way you can, whether or not it's by sports activities, yoga, anything, mindful meditation, whatever it is that can, dial down the stress level in your child as well as yourself.
Yeah.
I can say this, but, my son doesn't listen to a lot of what I say. So, I'm just giving advice, but not necessarily advice that my son will necessarily take.
Right.
But hopefully over the years, maybe he'll realize, maybe mom might be right in some things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that's great advice. And I often find myself giving my kids advice for their stress, but I forget to do it. So, it's like, maybe we can take our own advice or giving our kids and vice versa. But
or maybe you can do some, activities together that will reduce both of your stress.
Yes. I mean, yes. Yoga together, breathing together, just like I read something the other day that said, a 50-year-old can have the mind of a 15-year-old if they take 15 minutes to close their eyes awake and do nothing every day. And I thought, I can do that. Like, I can make myself do that. So anyway, I've loved talking with you. Thank you so much for the update. I hope we can catch up with you again sometime. And I just hope you have a great afternoon. I'll put all your information down below for everyone to get in touch with you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Nice talking with you. Bye-bye. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed what you heard today. I hope you got some great tips, and I hope you feel maybe a little bit less alone. If you'd like to see more interviews like this, you can check me out on all the socials, and the handle is @United in Autism. Also, check out YouTube for videos, and I hope we see you again next week. Thanks so much.